So, welcome to the last session of the OCaml workshop, and I hope you're still awake. And so there's going to be an introduction on the new things on Opam 2.2, and the last year in Opam, I think, by Raja, David, and Kate.
Thanks, Pierre. So, hello, everyone. As you saw, last July, Opam 2.2 was released. It was 3 years of work. Last major release, 2.1, was released on 2021. So it contains a lot of new features. There is some examples, a new command, Opam3, to permit to have to see the list of dependencies of a package in a tree view, and Opam for reverse dependencies. The ability to do recursive pinnings, it is used in the case your package is not on top of your source code repository, and you can just specify a subpath also. There is also the software heritage binding. Software heritage is a project that aims to archive all open source software. And in Opam, we added a binding to their archives to be able to retrieve the source of a package when the main one is missing. And there is also the support of formulas. Formulas was introduced on 2.1 for switch invariants. And for 2.2, we extended that support to install commands, for example. And of course, it's not the only features. There was a lot of enhancement about performance, UI, some quality of life improvements, and bug fixes, of course. So it took us 3 years. In the last one, there was 7 pre-releases. And after around 343 years later, Opam 2.2 was born. And speaking of quality of life features, usually it's option to already known commands like new way of pinnings or easy way to switch over your switches and things like that. Anyway, all that is for all the features are in the release note, the blog post. You can see, you can read that online. And you may notice I didn't speak about a tiny new feature in Opam 2.2, the Windows native support, but I'll let David talk about it.
So yes, Opam 2.2 has finally landed native Windows support. I think it's worth a little step back as ever to actually recap what we mean by native Windows support. The answer from our perspective is it's all about the C runtime library. So we heard earlier on today talking about WSL and WSL2 as ways of consuming OCaml on Windows, but this is a virtualization approach. It's basically giving you Linux on top of glibc. So there's nothing native about it whatsoever. It's a very good way of acquiring Linux OCaml on Windows, but it doesn't give you any ability to actually write Windows applications. There is also, from Red Hat, a solution called Cygwin, and there's a fork of that called MSys2, and that's slightly different. It gives a POSIX emulation based on the Windows API, but based on newlib, not as the C standard library. So it's almost native, but still not quite. These have been supported for quite a few years in OCaml and Opam readily. What we mean is GCC, provided by the MinGW W64 project, which gives you GCC on top of the C runtime library or the Microsoft UCRT, so the operating system's C standard library, or Microsoft C compiler from Visual Studio, which similarly is based on, unsurprisingly, on the Microsoft Universal C runtime. There have been out-of-the-box solutions before. I had a look on the INRIA website, and it turns out that there's been a binary zip of Windows binaries provided since at least OCaml 1.07, which is 1998. And I even discovered yesterday that that still runs on this laptop. So, INRIA provided a graphical installer until 4.2.3 that was maintained by Jonathan Prochenko that similarly installed the binaries of OCaml. Around OCaml 403 in 2016, OCaml for Windows was launched, which was a fork of Opam repository, but maintained by Andreas Hauptmann at FD Open, and he maintained that until around 2022. In August 2021, roughly, Jonah Beckford of Discov took that and added a lot more MSVC support to it and produced the DKML distribution, which until earlier this year was in fact the main recommended way to get native OCaml on Windows. So we haven't been we are not the first out-of-the-box solution for native Windows. We're part of a legacy of it. What is different, though, is that the OCaml installers that were provided before required the user to install and use additional tools. So if you wanted to use OCaml with the version from the INRIA website, you had to install Cygwin yourself, and you had to configure the paths correctly to be able to use it. Both OCaml for Windows and DKML bundled everything that they needed with them. They took an opinion on exactly how to get it and install it and recommend how to do that. They also end up wrapping Opam as a result, so you get this strange OCaml exec utop instead of Opam exec or just utop. And similarly, DKML has a with DKML wrapper. And in all of these cases, the main Opam repository on GitHub was either not used at all, or it needed a lot of additional downstream work to be used. And so we can very clearly see that Windows OCaml was very, very different from Unix OCaml. And that's what we've tried to address in Opam 2.2. There were quite a lot of changes that we'd already made in Opam. 2.0 actually built and passed its test suite on Opam, and the compilers had quite a bit of support added for Windows that was inspired by the need for Windows Opam over the years. What was missing was the actual packaging of the compiler in Opam repository for Windows, a ton of shell support, and some other subtle features in the way package handling works for Opam file descriptions. I'll talk a little bit about that now. In order to build OCaml on Windows, you do actually need a Unix environment. I mean, OCaml begins with a configure script, so something's got to be able to execute that. And that officially is done using the Cygwin environment. So the instructions for OCaml had always involved beginning in a Cygwin bash prompt in order to build OCaml. But what we want to do with Opam 2.2 and what we've achieved is that we want Windows users coming to OCaml who have no background in Unix not to need suddenly to learn how to use a Unix tool. So Opam 2.2 has the default ability to install a Cygwin installation automatically or not. So advanced users who wish not to do that can install and configure Cygwin and use Cygwin themselves and still use Windows Opam from it, or a new user who has no knowledge of Unix doesn't need to. As I said, the Windows philosophy is slightly different from the Unix philosophy in terms of querying things. So where Unix would have auxiliary programs to query things like terminal size, Windows has syscalls. It turned out to be an awful lot of glue that we had to put together on top of what's available in the Unix library. So we've now got well over 1,000 lines of non-trivial C stubs that we maintain, with none needed for Unix. Having this Unix support layer internally means that we've got two methods of paths going on. So Cygwin is a complete POSIX emulation. It has a root directory /, which Windows does not. So we can have paths coming from the Unix subsystem, paths coming from native Windows. We've got to be able to make the equivalent of Opam env work. We've got to be able to have packages that want to give descriptions of paths that are platform agnostic. That involved a very complicated set of rules that culminated in this xenv path rewrite that the very keen can go and see in the Opam manual. This allows us to specify portably updates to environment variables, which is a huge amount of work needed just to get Opam env to work and actually set path and all the other auxiliary variables correctly. Finally, having done that, we were then able to take the Opam repository compiler packages and upgrade them, which happened in mid-June, as I recall. And once all of that was put together, we finally have Opam 2.2, which actually works out of the box, with pretty much no special cases. And I shall give a short demonstration to prove this. So here you can see I have PowerShell. There is no bash prompt going to be visible in the course of this demonstration. We've been quite keen in this to make Windows Opam as easy to acquire as possible. We've been able to package it in Microsoft's Winget package manager, which is available on both Windows 10 and 11. So you can see here, it's the current version, so it's 2.2.1. It's actually downloading the exact executable from GitHub. It installs and configures it. I've already done that on this machine, at which point you then simply run Opam init, as you would on any other computer that you were sat at. At this stage, it gets slightly different. I'd mentioned that we know we need this Unix support infrastructure, and that gets put into place. What's happening here is that Opam is noticing that I perhaps know how to use Windows, and I have a few installations of my own. It's asking whether I'd like to use them or not, but still keeping the default option of saying, no, it would be safer if you just let me do this for you, so we can pick that. And then similarly, it moves on and does exactly the same thing for Git. It's got a little warning going on because it reckons that I've misconfigured this session, which it turns out I have. But again, it's giving an option to continue. So it's looking at what's on the system, determining if Opam can install that way, and giving as many options to the user as possible in terms of what they were actually expecting, rather than just mandating it must be configured this way or we won't work. That would take a little while to get through, so here is one I prepared earlier. Anyone who's used the Microsoft Visual Studio C compiler before will know it comes with a whole series of slightly arcane command prompts that you have to be able to get to. So by default, the C compiler CL is not available. That's one of the primary reasons for having these wrapper commands in the previous distributions. We've gone on a slightly different approach in Opam. So in fact, Opam manages that as part of an Opam repository package. So once I run the slightly strange equivalent of eval opam n for PowerShell, we now actually have the Microsoft C compiler immediately available, and you can see that I've also got OCamlOpt for MSVC64. And that's all working quite nicely. I can then show that some of the tools are working. So if we have Jane Street's base here, I can start Visual Studio Code, which it turns out was on the wrong screen. And you can just about see that it's there with editor support. You can see there's an LSP server prompt coming up. And I think if I point at some of these, you can see the Merlin prompts are coming back. So we have tooling is working completely in the Microsoft Visual Studio port there. We've been able to take advantage of some of the things that Opam 2.1 added. So in particular, this switch that I've created here is based on the Microsoft C compiler. I can very quickly change that simply by installing a signal package that says switch to MinGW. Opam does a little bit of solving work that I now have to talk over while it does it. But there we are, we're ready. So, and you can see at this stage, it's saying, OK, we'll get rid of all of the MSVC support packages that we've had to add. We will then add all of the things required to switch to GCC on Windows, and then it will rebuild the entire switch. Again, that would take a little while. So here, again, is one I created earlier. And again, you can see that we now have both OCamlOpt is there, and we've lost the C compiler. At that point, that didn't come in because it wasn't needed. And we can then show Merlin working in Vim for Windows. And you can see exactly the same effect here. If I do the type throwback down at the bottom, it's all working. The tooling is there. I am told there is another editor for Windows, but I don't know how to use it. What's still to do? Opam repository at the moment only has support for OCaml4 13+. That should be fine because, of course, everybody's using OCaml5. But in terms of parity, we will at some point later this year add 408 to 412, just to allow the same version matrix for libraries to be used on Windows as on Linux. The conf packages, which manage your external dependencies, some of those have been upgraded, a lot of them haven't. That's a blocker for just about anything using C bindings. It's very easy to do PRs for those, which I'll come to in a bit, but that needs to carry on being done. Opam 2.2, as we've already said, took a little while, and as a result of that, originally OCaml5 was going to be tied to there being Opam 2.2, and we kind of missed that boat. So there are various temporary workarounds and solutions that have been necessary for acquiring that on Windows. And now, of course, it's confusing because there are lots of sets of instructions, so we need to go through and find all of these workarounds and get rid of them. And Opam repository at the moment, while it's testing new PRs for Windows compatibility, it's not yet able to do bulk testing, and we hope to sort that out later on this year. The key thing about this is none of that actually requires a new release of Opam. That's all stuff that will just be one Opam update away once it's done. In terms of Opam, that little crazy expression that you had to type in PowerShell in order to get OPAM to work is not something that one's expected to have from memory. There are other shell integration things still in the pipeline to come. And unfortunately, the first time you run Opam update, you'll discover the need to make coffee. And we will be looking at performance improvements for some of these aspects under the hood. So it works. It doesn't always work quickly. Can you help? Yes, you most certainly can. You can help out updating conf packages on Opam repository. There are sample PRs for doing it. There have been discuss posts about it. There are blog posts. There are Discord ways of reaching out to people. That's exceedingly helpful. There's no competition for who gets there first. More importantly, you can test your libraries and your packages on MinGW64 and or MSVC. And having discovered that they work, you can go, woohoo! And if you do not discover they work, please report bugs on any issue tracker that you can find from amongst this list. I don't mind where it goes as long as we end up hearing about it. And with that, I shall hand over to Kate.
So, speaking of issues, This is a screenshot from OCaml24, so the OCaml workshop in about 2 years ago. And David said, like, Opam 2.2 will be released in a few more months, hopefully. Well, didn't really happen, so Opam 2.2 was released a couple of months ago instead. So what happens? Well, you can imagine Windows is hard. David is pretty knowledgeable about Windows, but some of us are not, so we had to learn a lot of things that are Windows specific, so C API, PowerShell, many things. Anyway, so those things are really hard. So it means that everything that you've done in the meantime, other bug fixes, features, and so on, are blocked by Windows. So everything gets queued, and it gets frustrating. It's a frustrating situation for users and us as well. The reason is historically we have tied releases with features. So, for example, 2.2 was a release that was going to be Windows. 2.1 was Deplaix and Opam lock. 2.2 is a bit special, but you get the idea. And to add onto that, you also have founding that are tied to features, and features are tied to releases, so everything is like a circle. So how do we fix this? We've decided to switch to a new release cycle, to a new release schedule, and there's going to be a time-based schedule. So every 6 months, we're going to do a release, similar to what the compiler or other big open source projects do. We'd like to do around October, April kind of thing to avoid big vacation and so on, but this is the idea. And we're fairly confident in 2.2 we've added a lot of tests, and we're fairly confident that new PRs won't break things, hopefully. Which means we can just at some point say, yes, we branch to a new branch, and then we do a release cycle. This way, we also avoid issues with the annoyance of waiting for a release for external contributors and users. And to prove that, we are currently doing the 2.3 release, which is slightly early than usual, just because we have things that we've done already during the 2.2 cycle, but we didn't want to merge it right away to avoid delaying again delaying the 2.2 release further. So we've had a lot of things to merge. And so the next release will be there in next month, probably. Speaking of release, how releases are done, just to explain a little bit for those who are not aware. So Opam has 3 active maintainers, so 3 of us, me, Raja, and David, as well as some maintenance and training and external contributors. For example, a few highly valued contributors have contributed things like Opam tree and the with dev setup, new options in 2.2. And just to explain like the job of a maintainer, we do community things like speaking here. We fix bugs. That's usually what people think when talking about maintenance. But we also think about how to make Opam evolve so things don't get stale and the OCaml ecosystem can grow and go forward. Speaking of going forward, I'm going to pass it on.
So, what's going next? As Kate said, there will be the 2.3 release. So the Opam 2 series will continue, but of course we have in mind Opam 3. But before that, we want to achieve some steps, some user surveys. Want to retrieve some information about how Opam is used today. What are the main workflows? What are the most used commands? For example, the unknown ones also. And we also want to discuss with the community about Opam future, what they want to have in Opam 3, what are the main missing points, the thing that they want to change. It's very open discussion. We will do that as special public meetings on top of our weekly meetings, the weekly meetings. And we have already some ideas for Opam 3, some change on the package file format, but in a more smooth way than Opam 2. We'll try to maximize the backward compatibility to avoid breaking things. We also want to rework and rethink some process like package installation to take advantage of relocation and caching. And also, for example, rework also the external dependency mechanism to have another way to specify and probe the information from the system. These are just small ideas of a long list, and it's open to discussion anyway. And for the surveys, for Opam Future, we will publish everything on OCaml Discuss. So keep an eye on it, and we are here to talk. So reach us. Thank you.
So there is a question from the Discuss, which asks if there is an external library on Windows, how you're supposed to install it. Like the example was GMP, for instance.
So yes, there is. A lot of those are actually getting via Cygwin. So they are used internally added. So the Deplaix mechanism manipulates the internal Cygwin package. There are quite a few examples of that already in Opam repository. In fact, I think GMP may already be done. So Opam install conf GMP, which should almost certainly work. But yeah, we can continue that as a pointer offline.
If I install Opam on Windows like today, and I use it to build my OCaml software, I didn't quite get what the binaries that I obtain in the end depend on. Can I give them to my friends? What can I do?
Yeah, so if you compile them with GCC, with MinGW, that executable will just pretty much run straight on any Windows machine you send it to, possibly modulo a runtime DLL. If you compile them with MSVC, you just have to install occasionally install the latest version of the Microsoft C runtime. But yeah, they're basically copyable.
Thanks.
Just like OCaml107.
So, other question? Let's thank the speakers again. And